Brian, thank you so much. That was terrific, and in many ways, a wonderful segue to thinking about where AI and LLMs can help us throughout the research process itself. And that can be, among undergraduate students, graduate students, research assistants, but also among faculty. I think there's a tendency in these conversations about the impact of AI in higher education to really focus on undergraduate teaching, and that's part of the purview of this committee as well. And I think that that's really important. But really, the impact of LLMs and AI more broadly stretches across all research, and where I think we spend a little less time these days, but probably should spend more time, is in how faculty themselves, how scholars are using AI in their daily research. And I think the lessons that we've thought about stretch across all end users of AI in the research process, although with some important differences between different kinds of users. So maybe we can proceed to the next slide. I think the key takeaway from our conversations and from much of the broader discourse around this issue is that LLMs and AI. I'm gonna use LLMs and AI interchangeably, although that is actually a mistake, a category mistake. But just for today's purposes, um, uh, they can be extremely helpful in the hands of domain experts. That is a key takeaway. And this is so because being able to use LLMs effectively, and that means both knowing what to ask for in the first place, how to ask for it, but then also, as Brian was already suggesting, knowing how to interpret the output, how to determine whether the output is helpful, whether it's accurate, how to improve it, how to incorporate into the subsequent research flow. All of that requires existing skills, existing knowledge, existing expertise. And so you can probably already anticipate the important punchline here. And that is that those with expertise, people who have already learned how to do research well, may benefit tremendously from having AI as a research partner, as a research assistant in some ways, as we were just hearing. Um, Although there's much to be learned on that front as well. But among those who have not yet developed those skills, having AI supplant their own creative work is terribly dangerous in the sense that it basically leads to the lack of the development of the skills and the knowledge and expertise in the first place. It leads to often a naive use of AI with potentially quite mixed or negative results for the research itself, and then therefore for knowledge generation and accumulation and more broadly. So I think that that's something we all have probably thought about to some degree, but it's something that we should be articulating quite clearly in thinking about our pedagogical goals and our goals for our own research enterprise. There are two kinds of expertise that we can think about here. When I talk about domain expertise, um, much of it is substantive expertise. That is actually knowledge of the field, of the theories, the substantive findings within the field, of the methods required to advance research, and what it takes to know when work is good or less good, let's say. And that could be our own work, the work of our peers, the work of students, and so forth. And as well as the work of AI agents, right, of LLMs producing output. I'm sure many of us who have played around with LLMs in various aspects of our daily lives, sometimes we're in awe of the results that LLMs can produce. They can be quite surprisingly good at various things. But just as often, they fail miserably, and often that requires the adjusting of prompts, pushing further. But sometimes you just kind of give up. Say this is just not an area where the LLM is actually going to be helpful for whatever reason, maybe because of the paucity of the training data, or maybe of the kind of uniqueness of the task at hand, whatever it might be. But to be able to tell when the LLM's output is or is not useful, is or is not accurate, requires the kind of ability to know what the right answer looks like. And so if somebody has been doing research for many years, a bad lit review quickly looks like a bad lit review. Although not always, but often. Or, a brainstorming a research question, let's say the questions that keep coming back are either kind of banal, have already been done, have already been explored thoroughly in the field. These are things that seasoned scholars can pretty quickly tell. It's kind of our job, partly, both as producers of knowledge and as teachers. And so when an LLM spits something back that is substandard, we can adjust to that and we can move forward in a productive way. Um, And again, that stretches from substance and theory all the way through methods, right? So maybe about code, as Bryant was suggesting, an LLM Claude, for instance, can produce terrific code, but it often stumbles, it often makes mistakes. And even if the code itself is sound technically, the LLM may be making bad decisions, poor decisions, like eliminating half the sample and marking it as NA in the data. Um, and somebody without the domain expertise in the methods involved may not be able to recognize those problems and move forward in a productive manner. So there's that, right? Substantive expertise in its own right. And I think the important thing to know here is scholars who have amassed some degree of expertise can probably use LLMs productively if they use them with great caution. But there is even a risk for them, and that is the risk of atrophy to some degree, and atrophy of existing skills. If you start routinely outsourcing certain aspects of your work to LLMs on an ongoing basis, it can become quite attractive. It can become kind of a crutch on which one leans on a frequent basis, and perhaps some of those underlying skills may deteriorate to some degree. But the challenge is even greater, of course, as we can all imagine, for students, whether undergraduate, graduate, for early stage scholars who have not yet amassed the expertise in a given domain or in both substantive and methodological. And here, I think the challenge of AI is even greater, and the potential negative consequences even more nefarious, because as we know, learning is supposed to be sometimes painful. It's supposed to be tough. It's supposed to be a matter of making mistakes, learning what those mistakes were on one's own, and then muddling through them, correcting them, and learning from the process. That is at the very heart of learning. And so, if those who have not yet developed a certain domain expertise, again, outsource much of that work to an LLM AI agent, then they may never learn the skills in the first place. And that is a serious problem. And then, of course, that's on top of that, on top of the pedagogical problem, there's the issue that the knowledge that's being generated in the process may just not be very good because it's sort of a house of cards stint on a faulty foundation that was not recognized as faulty by the scholar, by the young researcher. And so that is the challenge of our day. I should say with undergraduate students, this is something we've talked about quite a bit in this committee, but also in broader conversation, that to the degree that students are increasingly relying on AI to read, that is to synthesize reading, and to write, generate new content, then there is a big kind of fundamental question about where does learning occur? If we think when reading, if we think when writing, and we learn that process, and all of a sudden those things are not being done by students themselves, then that raises all kinds of challenges for learning more broadly. The other thing, very briefly mentioned, the other type of expertise is expertise with AI itself, the ability to know how to deal with poor output, how to select models. There are many of them. Each has its own pros and cons. How to do what some call prompt engineering. I frankly personally dislike that term. It's more like prompt messing around with. It's not very systematic for most part, but how to prompt the model iteratively, how to correct prompts, how to realize that, well, maybe the model's not responding to me well because I've sort of given the model the wrong instructions. Maybe I'll tweak them and kind of keep iterating until you get an output that you know is more effective and more appropriate. So that very notion of how to create prompts, what information models need to do their job, is itself a learned skill. Verifying output is a learned skill. How to build agentic frameworks that self-validate some of the output is also a skill that is being, kind of broadly, we're learning lessons about that collectively. And finally, knowing that perhaps the most important thing, what are these tools not good for? And there are lots of those things, but it's easy to gain a false sense of confidence in their ability to do pretty much everything reasonably well. I think this latter category of evaluation expertise, in some ways, is easier to deal with because these are specific skills that we can actually teach to students and to ourselves and one another because faculty often lack these skills as well. We can develop best practices for how to use AI LLMs effectively. The former category is much harder because in some ways the deeply ingrained use of AI in the process of learning substantive fields risks undermining that entire learning process. In some ways, what would be ideal is to kind of, although impossible probably at this point, is to restore graduate training and undergraduate training to kind of a pre-AI age. Then once people get their degrees, here's AI, now use it wisely. But of course, that's not how it the world works. So the challenge is how to help students figure out when to use AI in a way that serves their interests but doesn't undermine their learning goals. We can move to the next slide. And so, in some ways, we can also categorize the tasks themselves. We've categorized different kind of learning, but as Bryant already mentioned, there are certain tasks that are generally lower risk, although we should be cautious here too and not just assume that this is a blanket permission to use AI for everything. But tasks that are more administrative, that are not fundamentally creative, but are more about taking existing information and transforming it in some way. And so, let's say we've got citations in one citation format, let's say, I don't know, Chicago, and you want to translate them into American Sociological Association format. An LLM can probably do a decent job of that. And moreover, what's important is you can evaluate the output very quickly and relatively systematically. Are the years in the right place? Is the author ordered as it should be? Is it italicized or quoted as it should be? Cleaning code. Again, this is different than generating code, but rather solving coding problems, commenting on code. All these things can be handled by LLMs quite effectively. Summarizing information, they're very good at this, right? So dump in a 20-page text and summarize it in a paragraph. These are things that LLMs are good at, and these are low-risk tasks in the sense that it's relatively straightforward to accomplish them effectively. Now, even here, though, there are problems. So, if you never learn how to cite properly, that can be a problem. If you have the LLM comment your code for you, well, commenting actually is a skill itself where you actually end up exploring your code closely and thinking about what each line does. If you get an LLM to do that, you're missing that potential learning moment. Summarizing transcripts, maybe that's fine. But if you use an LLM to replace your coding, rigorous coding of say interview transcripts or your close reading of secondary material, there's something lost there. So again, this comes back to the degree of domain knowledge. If you've already gained these skills and you're using an LLM cautiously to help you just speed up things you would have done otherwise, maybe that's fine. If you're just starting off and learning, less is more, even among the low risk tasks. Now on the right, you've got higher risk tasks. These are substantive tasks. And I would broadly classify these as tasks that require some sort of a critical thinking and critical content creation. Deriving a novel theory is one example, interpreting cultural nuances, let's say in interview transcripts on some other primary data, making ethical calls about how to proceed with tricky research questions. It's not that AI cannot do this. It's just that handing the reins to AI is potentially irresponsible and can carry significant risks. Where AI can be helpful here is more as a conversation partner, brainstorming partner, but even there, one that's not granted too much authority. And so I think this set of tasks really stretches to anything that involves our creative enterprise and our critical thinking. Writing papers, obviously, writing lit reviews, deciding what literatures to rely on in the first place, how to generate new insights from an intersection of multiple literatures. These are kinds of core tasks. These are the core tasks that we are charged with as scholars. And so handing them off to an agent is problematic. And some people would say is actually unethical from a research standpoint. The question is, where is the boundary between handing something off wholesale versus using AI as a partner for thinking, much like you would do with a colleague, a friend, a peer, student, et cetera. I think on the latter front, there's a lot more profitable use of AI versus having it do things for us. And the final thing that maybe that I should mention on this slide, I won't go for too much longer, that came up in our committee. There's a kind of intermediate area between these two categories. Like, how do we think about research grants? Are research grants administrative documents, or are they creative products? Probably a little bit of both. And so saying, hey, ChatGPT, write me a grant to the NSF, problematic. Hey, ChatGPT, help me with a couple of sections that are a little more routine with my broader grant, or hey, ChatGPT, proofread this response for me, maybe more appropriate. And again, GPT here is just one example, but there are many models to choose from. So I think what's really important from a scholar's standpoint is for all of us together to think about how we should be doing our jobs as researchers in a way that that is responsible, ethical, that increases our efficiency and our ability to get our work done without supplanting the core functions of what it is that we do. And for students, how do we help them develop those skills in the first place without having AI do the hard stuff for them in a way that prevents them from learning altogether? Next slide, please. Um, and so, in terms of the different parts of the research process, I'll be quick here because I've talked about this a little bit already. In principle, AI can be helpful throughout the entire pipeline, right? When formulating research questions, brainstorming, thinking about lit reviews. And I say this to my students. I teach capstones quite often in sociology, and where students are expected within a course of a single semester to go from a hunch to a fully fledged research paper. And I allow them to use AI sparingly as a foil, as a conversation partner. What I try to highlight to them, although there is no enforcement mechanism per se, is if you let it do all of this stuff for you, you're going to learn nothing and you're going to produce bad research, which is sort of a double harm. It's a harm to you, it's a harm to the broader scientific community. And so, again, use it to think with, don't use it to do the thinking for you. And I think in terms of formulating research questions, research design and so forth, the main risk here, other than sort of skill atrophy and preventing of learning, is that there's a lot of hallucination potential. Models have limited knowledge. And so, a model's representation of the literature, its main kind of debates and currents in literature is likely to be quite different than what you would yourself develop if you did the reading. Similarly, models often come up with all kinds of ideas about what's been done in the past that may themselves be faulty. So again, buyer beware, to say the least. Then in terms of actually executing the data collection and analysis, here there's potential for tremendous breakthroughs, but also the usual risk of seduction is considerable. So, maybe it's actually interesting to think about how AI could scale up, let's say, qualitative interviews with representative samples and thousands of respondents, as opposed to what we typically do when we're limited by our time and effort and et cetera. But that's that's sort of a development of new research tools rather than having AI do the basic work for us. So AI shouldn't be doing interviews for us routinely. It shouldn't be the only actor analyzing our data, and it shouldn't certainly be the only actor that's running our statistical analyses. Again, it should be an assistant, it should be a helper, it should be a partner, but it shouldn't do the work for us. And there are many reasons for this. I won't get into them in much detail, but as somebody who does use computational tools quite often, I think that the thing that's really important to mention is that a lot of computational methods tend to vary quite a bit in their opacity, in the sort of the degree to which they're black boxed tools that obfuscate the relationship between data and concepts that we measure in them. And LLMs are at the very far end of that opacity. It's just very hard to know how an LLM goes from the data to the results. And so not only do we risk skill loss, as it's mentioned here, if we have the agents do all of our work for us, but we also don't really know what we're getting and why we're getting it, which is not very scientific. Finally, the last piece here is on writing and dissemination. Again, if we think about LLMs as partners, maybe good for going over our drafts, or brainstorming a structure of a given paper or whatever it might be, or our slide deck, editing our work and so forth, refining, but not doing the thing for us in the first place, because it'll do a poor job, and it also kind of removes the core function of what it means to be a scholar, leads to the loss of our voice as creative actors, and for students certainly prevents them from learning how to write and think in the first place. I won't go through this in too much detail, but I think it's important to just say that it's often useful to think through some of these insights by taking specific examples, and that can be a sort of a hypothetical exercise each one of us can do ourselves, or something that we want to offer as a resource as well, and to sort of think about, okay, well, what is the role of the human in the loop in any given part of the research process, right? So if you ask an LLM to summarize 20 key abstracts in a given research question, in this case about social media and voter turnout, where does the researcher intervene? How does the researcher know if the summaries are appropriate, if the references are the right ones, if the literature being explored is the most appropriate one, and to what degree is AI helping rather than harming? Similar with designing survey questions or interview questions, maybe good as offering some initial hunches or maybe going over first draft. Probably not great at doing it for us altogether. And we already talked about code and analysis of results. So thinking through specific applications, I think, is really important. The other thing to mention here very briefly, to come back to Brian's points, um, part of the job of the scholar is to make sure that they can stand by their findings, by their research in general. And so if we don't know how well an LM is producing output, then we can't stand behind our findings. That's true for our own research. But with research assistants, so one possibility going forward, as Brian was suggesting, is that LMs replace our human RAs. And I think that's a real risk. But there's another thing, which is that our human RAs will be using AI to do their RA work for us, and they already are, just like we are using AI in some parts of our own workflows. Being able to double check that the results produced by our RAs are correct is a key part of our jobs, right? There have been many scandals out there when people say, "Oh, I didn't do the work; it was an RA. I have no idea where fraud occurred." Right? That's not okay. That's not acceptable. And so, being able to see what RAs do, just like being able to see what we ourselves are doing, and verifying all of the output is super important. And to the degree that LLMs are involved in the process, and there's that model opacity that's happening, and on top of that, probably RAs are not reporting everything they're doing with LLMs, creates all kinds of other workflow issues that we should puzzle through as well. Um, Next, please. Right. Um, and so I think all of this that I've just mentioned comes back to some of this kind of an ethics checklist. As you're thinking about your research, whether you're doing it yourself, whether you're teaching it to students, whether you're having an RA help you, thinking about what is okay and what is not okay at every stage of the research, and really thinking like, if I'm doing it, would I be okay with someone else doing it? Would I be okay if I was a reviewer and I knew that another scholar did all of these things using AI? Would that be okay with me? Is really important, all the way from data privacy issues of, uploading PII, personal identifying information, to LLMs is a huge problem. Anything that's confidential shouldn't be going to LLMs, most of which are then use those data for training. And some of those data can be recovered if one uses LLM skillfully by others, or student grade and so forth. Being transparent in what AI was used for. I'm actually a big advocate for this in courses where I specifically ask students to tell me, you can use AI, but you have to tell me what you used it for, and some lessons that you learn along the way. I think journals probably will and certainly should be requiring all submissions to report where AI was used in the process. Um, Verification responsibility I was mentioning with the RAs, the buck stops with a scholar, whether that's a student in the class, that's their product. Somebody, they're using somebody else's material, that's their fault. With us too, right? Anything that goes into papers or books that we publish, we are responsible for. And blaming AI for making mistakes is not a reasonable defense. So that should be really a big warning for what we use AI for and how. And the fact that AI also has plenty of biases around race, gender, sexuality, or kinds of other characteristics of research subjects and content and so forth. And so being very, very careful with that is important. Next. I think that's it. I'll stop there. I went on for too long, but happy to have a conversation further after this.